A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Video Games That Are Totally Awesome. So I get the feeling that because of all the Gran Turismo games, there's probably going to be other long-running series that people will want me to discuss in this series in particular. So I feel like that one other series of games that I could talk about would have to be Transformers. I'll admit, there hasn't been all that much Transformers-related media that I've talked about in general, apart from maybe a handful of occasions before the blackout period ensured. So, there's plenty of times where I've talked about that, but for better context on what the blackout period was, there are some videos on my channel that will highlight that, especially in the vlogathon. So, you'll be sure where to find that. In any case though, with Transformers, there's been plenty of times, even up until this point in history, where I have talked about the movies, I have talked about the video games, and I've talked about many of the shows, including some of the more recent hits. But I feel like that we ought to do this right, to go through an entire marathon worth of the games. While I can't say much about the older games because that's sort of what Angry Video Game Nerd and whatnot are meant for, I will say we could probably go as far back as to when the first Michael Bay film came out in 2007. Transformers the game, which came around the same time in 2007, was made possible by Activision, and at the time did see a nice major release amongst many different consoles. You had a good handful out there, enough to rival such titles out there in more recent years, including Snoopy's Grand Adventure, which I've mentioned before had probably one of the largest strength of console releases in history. But we have the PSP, PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Windows, DS, Wii, and some others here and there. So you could say that that's a pretty strong point in which that they try to get this game available on as many platforms as possible, but at the same time, we can't exactly be certain of how it's going to hold up well enough today. But I'll get back to why that is in just a moment. Unfortunately, there's not much for me I could possibly identify with here, or that I could explain here. But one thing's for certain though, this game's not exactly based on the events of the movie from 2007, which is supposedly what this game does try to follow along with. I mean, it just utilizes the same old designs of Prime, B, Megatron, Starscream, Ratchet, etc. So you have quite the variety of Transformers to work with in this game. They not only bring along the likes of the original cast from the film, but also introduce other bots as well. There's a good amount of attempts made outside of the Transformers film series by Michael Bay and Paramount, or they do try to put together as many live-action adaptations of such characters out there. In this case, we do have some other instances. This was one of the first times in which that we get to see Shockwave in action just as well. And others like Trailbreaker, Hound, and even a few other notable entries from the G1 series have made their own comeback in the form of live action. Even though this doesn't necessarily count, or is considered canon by any means. But we can say they tried. They certainly did. And as the other games would come along, they wouldn't really follow any of the movies either. It seems that with the movies, they have their own plot and storyline, and I've talked about the Bayverse films before. All 5 of them. Then of course there was The Last Knight, Bumblebee, and one of the more recent ends of the film series, Rise of the Beasts. But with the Transformers games that tied themselves into the likes of the Bayverse films, none of them actually followed along with the events of the movie. It really does make you wonder, why would they even bother releasing games that are supposedly based off of the movies, whether it's for the success or otherwise? Well, I feel like one good way to say all this is that these games do supposedly help to build up some extra lore for Transformers fans of all sorts, in a similar regard as to how franchises like Star Wars and Star Trek, or even Sonic the Hedgehog, they have based a lot of their games as being way outside of what the original media themselves composes of. You could say that the Transformers games, in correlation to the Bayverse films as they were released the same year for each installment at the time, with the first game being released in 2007 with the same year of the first film, and then with Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon being released alongside their own respective sequels in the years of 2009 and 2011, these games did, in fact, shed light on a lot of new subjects and details, and even interlinked between the film's plots. So, you could probably say Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon probably do a much better job in trying to connect themselves to the films and even to build up supposed prequel or sequelism. So it's quite a unique idea that does actually exist in a lot of gaming, even to this day. Star Wars, for instance, if you remember Shadows of the Empire on the N64, that game actually gave us a storyline that took place between episodes 5 and 6. So, it did of course begin with the famous Hoth battle on episode 5, Empire Strikes Back. But in the case of Transformers, we get similar things going on here. It's quite obvious that they were taking plenty of liberties with these games, and that, at the end of the day, what really matters is that these games actually are more different than the films. They aren't just products that are specifically based off the films. They kind of invent their own storyline, their own plot lines, bring along characters, old as well as new, but some might wonder how exactly do the films not take advantage of the subplots or sub-elements of the games and other such media that have been released alongside the films. I guess we'll never know that for sure. The games tend to do way more than the films, one might say. But at the same time, we could also just say that with the huge budgets they put into making these films, it does sort of give off a bit of a limited feel to it. With how expensive it is to animate the Transformers and to create the unique special effects, including all of the explosions, it's probably no wonder why they don't exactly have everything in a perspective. They aren't thinking fourth dimensionally at some point, and they also aren't really going to listen to everything that the fans suggest to them, because these films are expensive to make from the get-go. Hundreds of millions of dollars go into them, after all, which is way more than the average filmmaker. So, it's true though, that you gotta spend money in order to make money, especially if you want it to be in the billions, which they were able to do so with a few of these films. But you know what though? I feel like that a good scoring for this is at least necessary. I will have much more to say about Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon because I have had those games on Xbox 360, but not the first, unfortunately. So, with Transformers the game, the first of its kind, the first to allow for such subplots and elements to be built in Transformers lore, especially with the Bayverse films coming around, we'll just go with a simple yet effective 7.0. Because on top of all that, guess what happened? Activision stopped paying for the rights for Transformers after August 2021, which really is quite a pain in the butt. You know, what if people wanted to get a hold of the game for nostalgic reasons? I'm sure that even AVGN might want to create an episode specifically off of the games entirely, knowing that he's not much of a fan of the newer Transformers films, or any of them in general. So I suppose that pretty much concludes another piece of video games that are totally awesome. This one's probably not as awesome though as the sequels, which I'll get to momentarily. But until then, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.